Women's suffrage in the UK was a movement to fight for women's right to vote in elections. Beginning in the late 19th century, women sought to change voting laws allow them to vote. It finally succeeded through two laws in 1918 and 1928. It became a national movement in the Victorian era. National and international organizations formed to coordinate effort toward that objective, especially the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, founded in 1904 in Berlin, Germany, as well as for equal civil rights for women.
Women who owned property gained the right to vote in the Isle of Man in 1881. And in 1893, women in the British colony of New Zealand were granted the right to vote. Most major Western powers extended voting rights to women in the anti-war period. Notable exceptions were France, where women could not vote until 1944.
The campaign for women's suffrage in Great Britain and Ireland gained impulse in the early part of the 19th century, as women became increasingly politically active. During the campaigns to reform suffrage in the UK, John Stuart Mill, elected to Parliament in 1865, campaigned for an amendment to the Reform Act in 1832 to include female suffrage. Thanks to this reform, a few women can vote in parliamentary elections through property ownership. This right was confirmed in the Local Government Act in 1894 and extended to include some married women. By 1009, more than 1 million single women could vote in local government elections in England.
In 1881, the Isle of Man passed a law giving the vote to single and widowed women who passed a properly qualification. This was to vote in elections for the House of Key in the Island Parliament. This was extended to universal suffrage for men and women in 1919. During the later half of the 19th century, a number of campaign groups for women's suffrage in national elections were formed in an attempt to lobby members of parliament and gain support. In 1897, 17 of these groups came together to form the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, who held public meetings, wrote letters to politicians, and published various texts. In 1907, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies organized its first flag procession. This march became known as the Mud March, as over 3,000 women.
In 1903, a number of members of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies broke away and, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, formed the Women's Social and Political Union. In 1905, at a meeting in Manchester's Free Trade Hall, Edward Grey, a member of the newly elected Liberal government, was speaking. As he was talking, Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Keeney of the Union constantly shouted out, "Will the Liberal government give votes to women?" When they refused to cease calling out, police were called to evict them, and the two suffragettes were involved in a struggle which ended up arrested.
After this media success, the Women's Social and Political Union became increasingly violent. This included an attempt in 1908 to storm the House of Commons, the arson of David Lloyd George's country. In 1909, Constance Lytton was imprisoned but released when her identity was discovered. She distinguished herself as a working-class seamstress called Jane Wharton and endured inhuman treatment, which includes force feeding. In 1913, Emily Davison protested to King George V during the running of the Derby. The Women's Social and Political Union ceased their militant activities during the World War I. The National Unions of Women's Suffrage Societies continued to lobby during the war years.
The Speakers' Conference on Electoral Reform represented all the parties in both houses and came to the conclusion that women's suffrage was essential. Regarding fears that women would suddenly move from zero to a majority of the electorate due to the heavy loss of men during the war, the conference recommended that the age restriction be 21 for men and 30 for women, About 8.4 million women gave the vote in Great Britain and Ireland. In November 1918, the Parliament Qualification of Women Act was passed, allowing women to be elected into Parliament.
Leslie Hume argues that the First World War changed the popular mood. Women's contribution to the war effort challenged the notion of women's physical and mental inferiority about them being unfit to vote. If women could work in munition factories, it seemed illogical to deny them a place in the polling booth. But the vote was much more than simply a reward for war work. The point was that women's participation in the war helped to dispel the fears that surrounded women's entry into the public area.
First wave feminism was focused on overturning legal inequalities, particularly addressing issues of women's suffrage. Second wave feminism broadened debate to include cultural inequalities, gender norms, and the role of women in society. Third wave feminism refers to diverse strands of feminist activity.
The early feminist reformers were unorganized and including prominent individuals who had suffered as victims of injustice. The first organized movement for English feminism was the Langham Place Cycle of the 1850s, which included, among others, Barbara Bodichon and Bessie Rainey Parks. The group campaigned for many women's causes. It also pursued women's property rights through its Merits Women's Property Committee. Bodichon published her brief summary of the laws of England concerning women in 1854, which was used by the Social Science Association after it was formed in 1857. In 1858, Barbara Bodichon, Matilda Mary Hayes, and Bessie Rainey Parks established the first feminist British periodical, the English Woman's Journal. The journal continued publication until 1864 and was succeeded in 1856 by the English Woman's Review.
Busheret, Barbara Bodichon, and Adelaide Proctor formed the Society for Promoting the Employment of Women. One of the earliest British women's organizations. Helen Blackburn and Busheret established the Women's Employment Defense League in 1891 to defend women's working rights. In the beginning of the 20th century, women's employment was still predominantly limited to factory labor and domestic work. During World War I, more women found work outside the home, as a result of the wartime experience of women in the workforce. The Sex Disqualification Removal Act 1919 opened professions and the civil service to women, and marriage was no longer a legal barrier to women working outside the home.
In 1918, Mary Stowe published the very influential Marriage Law, in which she advocated gender equality in marriage and the importance of women's sexual desire. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 extended the franchise to women who were at least 30 years old and they or their husband were property holders, while the Parliament Act in 1918 gave women the right to sit in Parliament. In 1928, the franchise was extended to all women over 21. Women need to fulfill their potential or their own nature, not only within the aspect of work, but society and home life too. Virginia Woolf produced her essay A Rooms of One's Own, based on the ideas of women as written and character in fiction.
Second wave, women's life. Much like the suffragettes before them, the activists of the women's liberation movement of the 60s, 80s realized that it was deeds, not words, that would win the day. They discovered that they would need to employ shock tactics in their fight, which largely focused on gaining equality in the workplace, in the family, and for rights over their bodies. But it was the subversive and spectacular acts that made it impossible for the world to ignore the inequality they suffered.
In June 1968, female sewing machinists at Ford factory went on strike. They objected to the fact that they were closeted and unskilled workers despite the fact that they needed to pass a skill test to be employed. This classification means that they earn less than men in equivalent work. On 28 June, all machinists traveled to London and marched through the streets of Whitehall. But it was not exactly glorious victory for the strikers. Their conditions were much improved, but they were still considered unskilled. They were not reclassified or given equal pay until they struck it again in 1984.
Many more controversial feminist strikes followed, including the Night Cleaners campaign of 1970, which sought to unionize the victimized and underpaid women who cleaned London's office block at nights. At the end of the 60s, women and feminist thinkers were ready to fight for equality. They had lived through a remarkable era of rapid social and cultural change. Women were still expected to earn less while they worked, to give up work when they got married or become pregnant, to settle down and be good housewives, and to serve their husband and children.
The third wave benefited from the preceding one but rejecting many of their mentalities. They believed that feminism should be for everyone, rejecting to the universal sisterhood as excluding LGBTQ and trans women and instead promoting a feminist defined by the individual. Lipstick feminists tossed aside the idea of the beauty as a patriarchal oppression and embraced push-up bras and high heels to prove that femininity and intelligence were not mutually exclusive. Pop stars like Madonna and the Spice Girls preached girl power in platform shoes and conical bras. Feminist writers included Rebecca Walker. Feminist writers include Rebecca Walker, who has fed up with discussions of a post-feminist age, Judith Butler, developed upon gender construct in Gender Trouble, and even Esler, encouraged women to love their bodies in the Vagina Monologues.